The clatter of fine china was the soundtrack of my life. A delicate, expensive sound that always felt like it was mocking me. I worked at the Gilded Lily, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, a place where the air smelled of truffle oil and old money. My uniform was a stark black dress, too tight, and shoes that pinched my feet. I was a ghost, a silent, moving part of the scenery for the city's elite. My name is Maya. And for 6 years, I've been a nobody. I knew the rules. Be invisible. Be efficient. Be silent. We were not to speak unless spoken to, our smiles were to be polite but not inviting, our eyes were to be downcast. We were human furniture. And then there was him. Julian Thorne. He came in every Tuesday night, like clockwork. The billionaire tech mogul, the city's golden boy. He was always alone, always at table 7, the best seat in the house, overlooking the city's glittering skyline. He never looked at me, not really. He'd order the same thing, a dry martini, the seared scallops, the filet mignon, medium rare. He'd spend the entire meal on his phone or staring out at the city, a king surveying his kingdom. The other waitresses gossiped about him. His ruthless business deals, his string of supermodel girlfriends, his penthouse that took up the entire top floor of the Thorne Tower. He was untouchable, a god living on Mount Olympus, and we were the mortals serving him ambrosia. I tried not to hate him. It was too exhausting. But sometimes when I was counting my tips, just enough to cover my rent and my mother's medical bills, and I'd see his picture in the society pages standing next to a yacht, I'd feel a hot sharp spike of resentment. The universe was not fair. I knew that. But Julian Thorne was a walking, breathing monument to that unfairness. One Tuesday, a storm was brewing outside. The sky was a bruised purple, and the first drops of rain began to hit the panoramic windows of the Gilded Lily. Julian Thorne was later than usual, and he was agitated. He snapped at the sommelier, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the white linen tablecloth. He was on his phone, his voice a low, tense hiss. No, it has to be tonight. The transfer must go through before the Asian markets open. I don't care how you do it, just make it happen. I placed his martini on the table. As I set it down, my tired hand, slick from carrying a heavy tray, slipped. The glass tipped, spilling a small, clear pool of gin and vermouth onto the tablecloth. Time stopped. He looked up from his phone. For the first time, his eyes, a piercing, cold blue, met mine. They weren't just annoyed. They were furious. A deep, terrifying rage that seemed to suck all the air out of the space between us. You clumsy idiot, he snarled, his voice low but vibrating with fury. I'm so sorry, sir, I'll get that cleaned up right away, I stammered, my face burning with a humiliation so profound I felt dizzy. He didn't reply. He just stared at me with that blistering contempt as I fumbled with a napkin, sopping up the tiny spill. In my panic, my elbow knocked against his leather portfolio, which was leaning against the table. It fell to the floor, spilling its contents. Now what, he snapped, leaning down to scoop up the papers himself, as if my touch would contaminate them. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I repeated, the mantra of the powerless. I bent to help him, my vision blurry with unshed tears of shame. That's when I saw it. Among the spreadsheets and contracts was a single, yellowing piece of paper, unlike the others. It was a handwritten letter. And as he frantically gathered his documents, a small, faded photograph slipped from the folded letter and skittered across the floor, coming to rest under my shoe. He was too busy with his papers to notice. I palmed it instinctively, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was an act of petty defiance, the only one available to me. I rushed away, my hands shaking, the small photograph burning a hole in my palm. I hid in the server's station, behind the giant coffee machines, my back against the cool wall. I unfolded my hand. The photograph was old. It showed a woman with a kind, tired smile, holding the hand of a young boy. They were standing in front of a modest, slightly run-down house. The boy, there was something in his eyes. A familiar intensity. It was Julian. A young Julian Thorne. He looked thin, poor, and nothing like the polished billionaire he was today. And scrawled on the back of the photo, in a delicate, feminine handwriting, were 3 words, for my Julian. My mind raced. This didn't fit the narrative. The official story was that Julian Thorne was old money, a legacy from a wealthy family. This photo told a different story. A story of hardship. Later that night, as I was cleaning his table after he'd left, I found something else. Wedged between the seat cushion and the arm of the plush banquette was a small, black, encrypted thumb drive. It must have fallen from his portfolio during the commotion. He was long gone. The drive was in my hand. It felt heavy, dangerous. My first thought was to turn it in. But the memory of his eyes, that searing contempt, stopped me. You clumsy idiot. I was a nobody. I was invisible. And right now, being invisible was a superpower. That night, in my tiny, shabby apartment, with the rain lashing against the window, I stared at the thumb drive and the photograph on my rickety kitchen table. They were pieces of a puzzle. A puzzle a billionaire had carelessly dropped, and a nobody waitress had picked up. This wasn't just about spilled martini anymore. This was about spilled secrets. I plugged the drive into my old laptop. It was password protected, of course. But I had a secret of my own. Before my life fell apart, before my father died and the medical bills started, I was at the top of my class in computer science. I'd left that world behind, but the skills were still there, rusty but functional. It took me most of the night, but I bypassed the security. It wasn't military grade, it was the arrogance of a man who never thought anyone would dare look. I opened the first file. It was a bank statement. But the numbers, they were wrong. The balances were astronomical, but the account activity was strange. Huge, circular transfers between shell companies I recognized from my father's old business journals as being notoriously shady. I opened another file. A deed to a property. The Thorne family estate. According to this, it wasn't an inheritance. It was purchased just 8 years ago, with a loan from a bank in the Cayman Islands. File after file, a terrifying picture began to develop. The real estate, the art collection, the stock portfolio, it was all a house of cards. A brilliantly constructed, incredibly elaborate fiction. Julian Thorne wasn't a billionaire. He was the world's most successful con man. His entire fortune was a mirage, built on debt, forged documents, and the unwavering perception of his wealth. The clumsy idiot waitress had just stumbled upon the biggest financial secret in the city. And I had no idea what to do with it. But as I looked from the damning files on my screen to the faded photograph of the poor boy and his mother, I knew one thing for certain. The nobody was about to become a very big somebody. And Julian Thorne's fake fortune was on the verge of a very real collapse. The world looked different in the cold light of morning. The thumb drive sat on my coffee table, an unassuming sliver of plastic that held the power to shatter a universe. The initial thrill of discovery had been replaced by a cold, creeping fear. What was I supposed to do? Go to the police? The media? They were all part of the world that worshipped Julian Thorne. He would bury me. I went to work at the Gilded Lily, moving through my shifts like an automaton. Every time the door opened, my heart leapt into my throat, expecting to see him, flanked by lawyers and security, there to accuse me. But the day passed with a terrifying normalcy. He wasn't scheduled to come in until Tuesday. I had time. But time for what? I was a waitress with a secret that could topple an empire. And I was utterly, completely alone. That night, I went back to the files. I needed to understand the how. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. It wasn't just one lie, it was 1,000 interconnected lies, each propping up the other. He had fake insurance policies on his fake art, loans against his fake stock, and he used that phantom wealth to secure real power, real influence, and very real lines of credit from banks that should have known better. His entire life was a performance. And I was the only one in the audience who knew the script was fake. But why? The photograph of the poor boy provided the motive. This was all born from a desperate, pathological need to escape that past. He hadn't just wanted wealth, he had wanted to reinvent himself so completely that the boy in the photograph would cease to exist. A part of me, the part that remembered my own struggles, felt a pang of something that wasn't quite pity, but understanding. Then I remembered the contempt in his eyes. You clumsy idiot. He hadn't escaped his past, he had become a monster forged by it. I needed a plan. I couldn't just expose him. He'd discredit me, destroy the evidence, and I'd be the crazy waitress who tried to slander a billionaire. My revenge needed to be as silent, as precise, and as devastating as his deception. I started small. I created a new, anonymous online identity, a ghost in the machine. I called myself Veritas. Using public Wi-Fi from different cafes, I began to plant seeds. I didn't release the big stuff. Instead, I went to obscure financial forums and message boards, posing as a curious analyst. Noticed some odd circular trading patterns in shell companies linked to Thorne Holdings. Anyone else see this? The provenance on that Picasso Thorne just acquired seems a bit murky. The records from that Swiss gallery are surprisingly sparse. They were tiny, almost invisible nudges. Drops of poison in a vast ocean. Most were ignored. But a few were picked up by fringe financial bloggers, the kind who thrived on conspiracy theories. It was a start. My break came from an unexpected place. Buried deep in the files was a single-line item, a recurring monthly payment to a private nursing home. The recipient's name was Eleanor Thorne. His mother. The woman from the photograph. According to the records, she was still alive. The mighty Julian Thorne, who presented himself as a self-made orphan, had a living mother stashed away in a facility. The payment was modest, almost meager, especially compared to his ostentatious spending. It was the one thread that seemed real. The one vulnerability in his armor of lies. The following Tuesday, I was a bundle of raw nerves. Julian Thorne arrived for his dinner. He was calmer this time, back to his aloof, untouchable self. He didn't even glance at me. I was furniture again. But I was watching him now with new eyes. I saw the performance. The way he held his fork, the cut of his suit, the casual way he checked his Patek Philippe watch, it was all part of the character he was playing. And he was a brilliant actor. As I served his filet mignon, my hand was steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. I had a target. The next day, my day off, I took a bus to the outskirts of the city. The address led me to Willow Creek Manor, a clean but depressingly average nursing home. It was a far cry from the luxury his public image would suggest. I used a pretext at the front desk, saying I was a volunteer from a new church program. I asked if an Eleanor Thorne was a resident and if she ever had visitors. The nurse, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, shook her head. Poor Eleanor. Sweet as can be, her mind isn't what it used to be. Early onset dementia. Her son pays for everything, but he never visits. Sends a lawyer once a year to check on the paperwork. It's a shame. My heart ached for the woman in the photograph. And my resolve hardened against the man she'd raised. I couldn't see her. It felt like too much of an invasion. But I knew she was the key. She was the living proof of his origin story, the one person who could, in a moment of clarity, unravel his entire narrative. I went back to my ghostly work, but now my focus had shifted. I needed to orchestrate a confrontation he couldn't control. I needed to force the boy from the photograph to meet the billionaire he had created. I began crafting my masterpiece. I didn't want to just leak the data. I wanted to deliver it. I wanted to see his face when he realized the game was over. I spent weeks planning. I studied his schedule, his habits. I learned about the annual Thorne Foundation Gala, his biggest, most public event of the year, where he preened for the press and his high society sycophants. It was the perfect stage. I wouldn't crash the party. I was done being the intruder. I would use his own systems against him. Using my old skills, I found a vulnerability in the gala's digital RSVP and presentation system. It was a simple backdoor, left open by a lazy IT contractor. I planted a digital bomb. A single file, hidden deep within the presentation software, set to activate when he took the stage for his big speech. The file contained just two things. The scanned image of the faded photograph of him and his mother. And a single, stark sentence in bold, white letters on a black background: a legacy built on lies will always crumble. Ask Eleanor. It was a risk. It might not be enough to bring down his entire empire. But it would be enough to shatter his invincible image. It would create doubt. It would send the vultures, the real financial analysts and journalists, sniffing in the right direction. The house of cards would tremble. The night of the gala, I didn't go to the Gilded Lily. I sat in my dark apartment, my laptop open to a live stream of the event. I watched as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling his empty smile. He looked like a king. He stepped onto the stage, into the spotlight. The crowd applauded. He began his speech, talking about innovation, philanthropy, legacy. The words were hollow. I knew the truth hiding behind his eyes. He clicked the button to advance his slides. The giant screen behind him, which was supposed to show graphs of his charitable donations, went black. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then, the photograph appeared. 20 feet tall. The young, poor Julian and his tired, loving mother. The crowd fell into a confused, murmuring silence. Julian Thorne froze. He stared at the screen, his face a perfect mask of stunned horror. The confidence drained from him, leaving behind the scared, thin boy from the photograph. He was exposed. Then the text appeared below the image, burning into the screen, and into the consciousness of everyone in that room. A legacy built on lies will always crumble. Ask Eleanor. The murmurs turned into a roar of confusion. Camera flashes exploded. Julian stood paralyzed, his mouth slightly agape, a statue of his own ruin. I closed my laptop. The silence in my apartment was absolute. The ghost had spoken. The nobody had been heard. And the billionaire's fake fortune had just met its very real reckoning. The fallout was immediate and vicious. It wasn't the nuclear explosion I had half expected, but a slower, more insidious collapse, a financial cancer metastasizing in real time. The live stream was cut, but it was too late. Dozens of phones had captured the moment. The image of the stunned billionaire and the haunting photograph went viral within the hour. The caption, "Ask Eleanor," became a global meme. At first, his PR team went into overdrive. They called it a malicious hack, a deepfake, a cruel joke by a competitor. They tried to paint Julian as the victim. But the seeds I had planted as Veritas began to sprout. The fringe financial bloggers I'd nudged weeks before now had a rocket of credibility strapped to their backs. Major news outlets, initially skeptical, couldn't ignore the bizarre story. They started asking the questions I had anonymously posed. Where did the Thorne fortune really come from, An in-depth look at the shell companies behind Thorne Holdings. Who is Eleanor Thorne? Reporters descended on Willow Creek Manor. The kind-faced nurse, now a reluctant media star, confirmed everything. Yes, Eleanor Thorne lived there. Yes, she was Julian's mother. No, he never visited. The human story was the sledgehammer that broke the dam. The narrative of the self-made orphan was a lie. If he could lie about something so fundamental, what else was a lie? The financial world, built on confidence and perception, began to panic. Banks that had lent him millions based on his assets started calling in their loans. His business partners demanded emergency audits. The stock of his publicly traded companies went into freefall. I watched it all from the sidelines, still serving martinis and filet mignon at the Gilded Lily. The restaurant was abuzz with the scandal. The very people who had once worshipped Julian Thorne now feasted on his carcass with gleeful schadenfreude. He didn't come in for his Tuesday reservation. A week after the gala, I was cleaning a table when a familiar, grim-faced man walked in. It was Mr. Sterling, the restaurant's owner. He rarely made appearances on the floor. Maya. My office. Now. My blood ran cold. This was it. He knew. I followed him into his plush, wood-paneled office, my heart pounding. He sat behind his desk and stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. I've had a very interesting visit from Mr. Thorne's lawyers, he began, his voice dangerously calm. They presented me with some digital evidence. Traced back to our Wi-Fi network. Specific login times that correspond with your shifts. I said nothing. My mouth was dry. They believe a disgruntled employee is behind this unfortunate situation. He leaned forward. They are prepared to be lenient if the person in question returns all stolen property and signs a very comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. In return, all legal action will be dropped. He was offering me a way out. A silent, shameful retreat back into obscurity. I thought of the fear, the powerlessness I'd felt for so long. I thought of the contempt in Julian's eyes. I thought of Eleanor, forgotten in her nursing home. I looked Mr. Sterling directly in the eye. I don't know what you're talking about. He sighed, a sound of profound irritation. Maya, don't be a fool. They will destroy you. You're a waitress. He's Julian Thorne. He was Julian Thorne, I corrected him, my voice quiet but steady. And I am just a waitress. Which is why I have nothing to lose, and you have a restaurant full of very rich clients who would love to know their owner caves to bullies. His face went pale. The power dynamic in the room had just subtly shifted. Get out, he whispered. I walked out, my knees weak but my spirit soaring. I had faced him down. The nobody had stood her ground. The following month was a symphony of collapse. Julian Thorne's empire was officially declared bankrupt. His assets were seized. The Thorne Tower was repossessed by the bank. The Picasso was revealed to be a masterful forgery. Every headline was another nail in his coffin. I quit my job at the Gilded Lily. I didn't need it anymore. Using a small portion of the savings I'd meticulously gathered, I started my own business. A small, discreet cybersecurity firm, specializing in helping small businesses protect themselves from predators like the man I'd helped take down. I called it Veritas Consulting. One afternoon, I was working in my new, small but sunny office when my assistant told me I had a walk-in without an appointment. Annoyed, I told her to send them in. The door opened, and Julian Thorne walked in. I barely recognized him. The billionaire swagger was gone. He was thinner, dressed in an off-the-rack suit that didn't fit quite right. His eyes, once so cold and arrogant, were haunted. He looked every one of his 45 years, and more. He stood in front of my desk, not as a king, but as a supplicant. Maya, he said, his voice rough. Mr. Thorne, I replied, not offering him a seat. To what do I owe the pleasure? He flinched at the use of his name. I know it was you. I said nothing. I just waited. I lost everything, he said, the statement simple and devastating. Because of a spilled drink. No, I said softly. You lost everything because it was never yours to begin with. You built it on a foundation of nothing. I just turned on the light so everyone could see. He looked around my modest office, a bitter smile twisting his lips. And you got your revenge. You've done well for yourself. This isn't revenge, Julian, I said, and for the first time, I meant it. This is consequence. You reaped what you sowed. I just collected the harvest. He was silent for a long time, just standing there, a broken man in the office of the woman he'd once called a clumsy idiot. Why, he finally asked, his voice a broken whisper. Why did you do it? I thought about it. I thought about the resentment, the anger, the hunger for justice. But in that moment, looking at the hollowed-out man before me, the true answer was clear. Because you looked at me and saw nobody, I said, my voice filled with a quiet, unshakable power. And I wanted to prove to you, and to myself, that you were wrong. Our eyes met. The hierarchy of our old world was gone, replaced by a terrible, stark equality. The billionaire and the waitress. The con man and the ghost. He had nothing left to say. He turned and walked out of my office, closing the door softly behind him. The revenge was complete. But as I sat in the silence, I felt no joy. Only a profound, echoing sense of closure. The chapter was over. The nobody was somebody. And she was finally, completely, free. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of even the most dramatic events. A year after Julian Thorne walked out of my office, the scandal was a footnote in business textbooks, a cautionary tale about the perils of perception over reality. My company, Veritas Consulting, was thriving. I had found my purpose, not in tearing down, but in building up, in offering a shield to those who couldn't afford to be preyed upon. I had money now. Not billionaire money, but enough. Enough for a comfortable life, for security, for my mother's care. The gnawing anxiety of poverty was a ghost I had finally exorcised. But one ghost remained. Eleanor Thorne. I'd followed the news about her. With Julian's assets seized, the payments to Willow Creek Manor had stopped. A court-appointed guardian had been assigned, and a small, means-tested government stipend was covering her basic care. It was a bleak, impersonal end for the woman in the photograph. I couldn't get her face out of my mind. Her kind smile, her tired eyes. She was an innocent casualty in her son's war against his own past. One sunny afternoon, driven by a compulsion I didn't fully understand, I drove back to Willow Creek Manor. I didn't pretend to be a volunteer this time. I asked to see Eleanor Thorne, stating I was an old friend of the family. The nurse, a different one this time, led me to a sunroom at the back of the building. Eleanor was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, a thin, knitted shawl around her shoulders. She was staring out at a small, manicured garden, but her eyes were distant, seeing a different time, a different place. She looked frail, the woman from the photograph faded almost to transparency. I sat in the chair beside her. "Hello, Eleanor." She turned her head slowly, her eyes focusing on me with difficulty. They were the same blue as Julian's, but where his had been cold, hers were just lost. "Do I know you, dear?" she asked, her voice thin and reedy. "No," I said gently. "But I knew your son, Julian." A flicker of something, pain, recognition, love, crossed her face. "Julian. My boy. He's so busy. Always so busy. Building his empire." She said it with a mother's pride, a memory untouched by the present reality. My heart ached. Her dementia was her shield, protecting her from the truth of her son's downfall. "He did build an empire," I said, choosing my words carefully. "He was very determined." She nodded, a slow, shaky movement. "He always wanted to be somebody. Ever since he was a little boy. He hated that old house. Hated being poor." She looked out the window again. "I tried my best. But it was never enough for him." We sat in silence for a while. I held her hand, her skin papery and cool. I didn't say anything about the scandal, the lies, the ruin. There was no point. In her world, her son was still the successful man she was proud of. Before I left, I spoke to the administrator. I paid off her outstanding bills and set up a private, anonymous fund to cover her care for the rest of her life. It would ensure she had the best room, extra comforts, dedicated attention. It wasn't out of guilt. It was out of a sense of justice for the woman who had been written out of her own son's story. As I walked back to my car, I felt a final piece of the puzzle settle into place. My revenge on Julian Thorne was complete, but this act felt like something more. It was an absolution. Not for him, but for me. It was the assurance that I had not become like him, that my power would be used for protection, not destruction. I never saw or heard from Julian again. Rumor had it he'd left the country, a broken man living off what little he'd hidden away, forever running from the ghost of the boy he had been. My life moved forward, full and quiet. I thought the story was over. Then, a package arrived at my office. It was a plain, brown cardboard box, with no return address. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, was a small, worn, leather-bound journal. There was no note. With a sense of foreboding, I opened it. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. It was Julian's. It was his private journal, from the early days, when he was first constructing his new identity. Page after page detailed the lies, the forgeries, the constant, gnawing fear of being discovered. It was a confession, in his own hand. But it was the last entry that made my breath catch. The waitress. Maya. She sees me. Not the billionaire, but the fraud. There is a clarity in her eyes that terrifies me. She is the only real thing in this world of smoke and mirrors I have created. And I am certain she will be my undoing. A part of me almost welcomes it. This charade is a prison of my own making. Perhaps being seen, truly seen, even in condemnation, is the only freedom left. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. He had known. On some level, he had known it would be me. He had seen the nobody and recognized a force he couldn't control. This journal was his final, twisted act. A tribute? An apology? A way to ensure that I, the architect of his ruin, would forever be tied to his story? I didn't know. I locked the journal away in a safe. It was a piece of history, a dangerous one. Perhaps one day I would destroy it. But for now, I would keep it. A reminder. The girl who had been a nobody waitress now held the entire, complete truth of a billionaire's rise and fall. The fake fortune was gone. The lies were exposed. But the truth, in all its painful, complicated glory, remained. And it belonged to me. Revenge is not always about wealth or power. Sometimes, it is simply about the ownership of truth. The world may see a nobody, but inside that nobody is a force that can topple giants. The most powerful fortune you can ever possess is not made of gold, but of integrity. And no one can ever take that from you. This has been Silent Revenge.